So, top Democrats insist they are behind President Biden if he runs for re-election. The president has said multiple times he intends to run in 2024. But that's not doing much to stop the chatter about other possible contenders. A recent poll by Harris and Harvard University shows 71% of registered voters say Biden should not run again. When asked why, 45% said flat out he's a bad president. 30% say he's too old, while 26% say it's time for a change. So let's bring in Byron York, chief political correspondent for the Washington Examiner. Good to see you, Byron. Before we get started here, I want you to take a listen to Jay Johnson from the Obama administration talking this morning about this topic.
I don't know that Joe Biden has definitively made up his mind to run in 2024. I'm sure at some point he's going to have that conversation with his family. My advice would be unconventional. Make that if you're not running, make that announcement sooner rather than later.
Byron, sooner than later, what do you think the calculation is there?
Well, I think the former Homeland Security Secretary, Jay Johnson, was thinking in terms of what's best for the Democratic Party. This would give the Democratic Party more time to find a successor to Joe Biden. I think what Joe Biden hears is no way, because the moment he announces that he's not running again, all of the talk, the whole conversation turns to who's going to be the next Democratic nominee for president. Now the president himself is not running for re-election. It's kind of like the situation you have in the Republican Party, where if Donald Trump announced today that he is not going to run in 2024, the whole conversation would shift to who is. So President Biden is really stuck right now in this position of saying that he will run, even if he himself has doubts about it.
Well, and he doesn't exactly have a lot of strong support out there publicly either from people in his own party. And one example here, we were doing an interview with Colorado Senator, incumbent Democrat Michael Bennet in the lead up to the primaries. One of the questions we asked him was, quote, Biden won Colorado in 2020. Do you want him to campaign for you here in Colorado? Here's his answer, quote, he came out to the state when we had the terrible fires in Boulder County at the end of the year last year. And he was there to help cover people and also show that we were trying to respond. The federal government was trying to respond. So, I mean, I think that was helpful. And if we have a need like that again, I'd be glad to have them. Otherwise, I haven't given that much thought. Biden won Colorado, Byron, as you know, by 12.5 points. And he hasn't thought about it?
Well, that was not exactly a yes,
right?
Was it? Look, this is a problem that Democrats knew they were going to have. I mean, Joe Biden's age has always been known. He'll be 80 this November, 82 at the end of his term. And he's got a lot of things going against him right now. First are a bunch of really, really bad issues, the biggest and most serious being inflation. And you saw in that Harvard-Harris poll that the largest single group of people just thought he hasn't done a good job as president. But then there are those who think he is too old, and he is most definitely too old, they believe, for a second term, which would last until he's 86 years old. The question then is who in the world could succeed him? The problem Democrats face is that the vice president, Kamala Harris, the natural heir, the natural successor, is not really very popular with the voters either.
Well, right, you bring up the next point that I was going to ask you about, which is the Democratic bench. So are they kind of in a strange situation here because it's before the midterms, right? They don't want to have a lame duck president by saying he's not going to run, but then they have a bench issue here, don't they?
Yeah, well, if you remember, in 2020, they had a really big primary race, or 20-plus Democrats were running. And, I think it's fair to say that every single one of them wants to run again, including Bernie Sanders, the only candidate who was older than Joe Biden. So they, Pete Buttigieg, Elizabeth Warren, they all want to run. And, of course, Kamala Harris was part of that field and became vice president. But listen, I think Democrats would have a very hard time, if President Biden were not to run, they would have a very hard time rejecting the sitting vice president, obvious successor, plus the first vice president who is a woman of color. It'd be very hard for the Democratic Party to say, no, we're going to pick somebody else.
And while all of this is going on, Republicans are sitting there behind the scenes also wondering when the former president is going to make his decision about running and when it's going to be made public.
Well, we've been hearing some gossip and rumors out of Trump world that perhaps Donald Trump will announce sooner rather than later that he's running for another term in 2024. That would really throw an X factor into the midterm races. I think a lot of Republican strategists would rather that not happen because they want their clients' races for the House and the Senate to be about the House and the Senate and not all about Donald Trump. And Donald Trump tends to make whatever he's doing all about Donald Trump. But he is going to have to make a decision sometime. What is interesting right now is we do see a significant number of Republicans who appreciate Trump's achievements. They supported Trump. They think he was a good president, but they also think it is time to move on. Either they think he should just let it go. They don't like the obsession with the 2020 election. They just think it's time for a change, something like that. So we'll see how strong they are in the Republican Party if Trump chooses to run again.
Okay. Byron York from the Washington Examiner. Thank you.